This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals, and if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. It isn't every day you get to talk to one of the 720 members of the European Parliament, one of the two legislative bodies of the European Union. For me, it has happened once, a week ago, when I spoke to Johan Van Overtveldt, now in his second 5-year term representing Belgium in the Parliament and serving as chair of the Parliament's Budget Committee. Van Overtveldt, who previously served as Belgium's Minister of Finance, their version of America's Secretary of the Treasury, is a conservative. At home, he's a member of the new Flemish Alliance, and in Parliament, a member of the European Conservatives and Reformists group. European and American conservatives have their similarities, but the match isn't perfect. I asked Member Van Overtveldt how he would categorize himself in American terms, and I'll let him speak for himself. But for now, think, maybe a generous Reagan, but supportive of gay marriage and concerned about climate change. Prior to transitioning into politics, Van Overtveldt worked in banking, he worked in finance, and he spent decades as an economic journalist. There's a reason he was Minister of Finance and is now chair of the Budget Committee. He really knows his stuff, and he has the industry connections and pragmatic approach you'd expect of someone who spent a career outside politics. Van Overtveldt has also written a number of books. His first came from his dissertation. He received his PhD in applied economics from the University of Antwerp, and then he wrote a dissertation on the Chicago School of Economics, like, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Ronald Coase, and so forth. I spoke to him about his most recent book, The Icarus Curse: How Western Democracies Derailed and How to Get Back on Track. The basic premise is that Western democracies, very much including the United States, have been living beyond their means for generations and are reaching a point of true policy exhaustion. What started as John Maynard Keynes' innovation of deficit spending to stimulate aggregate demand when demand fell, like during a financial crisis, such as the Great Depression, uh, that became an excuse for politicians to make promise after promise after promise, without, it should be noted, ever fully delivering what people have now come to expect of their government. In 1964, 77% of Americans trusted their government to do the right thing just about always or most of the time. By 1979, that was 27%, and it hasn't exceeded 24% since before President Obama took office. Only part of that is about the mismatch between what people have come to expect of their government and what the government can actually deliver, but it's a real part. This isn't one party's fault. On the one hand, you have Democrats happy to spend, but ultimately uncomfortable with raising taxes. On the other, you have Republicans happy to cut taxes, but less good at actually cutting spending. And there's a strong argument to be made that what they are trying to cut, it's not just fraud, waste, and abuse, is exactly the sort of public investment spending you shouldn't be cutting. President Trump and congressional Republicans argue that the big, beautiful bill, working its way through Congress now, will stimulate the economy so much that tax revenues will eventually wipe out what the Congressional Budget Office projects to add $2.4 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. But how confident are you that's actually the case? I'm not an economist, I'm not an actuary, and I'm not a politician, but it sounds more like wishful thinking than real math. Ultimately, the Pied Piper is going to come calling. There will come a financial meltdown or a war or a series of natural disasters that we don't have the borrowing capacity to simply paper over. So what do? How do we gird ourselves against the unpredictable crises to come? Well, those questions are why I wanted to talk to Johan Van Overtveldt. Member Van Overtveldt, good night from the United States and good morning in Belgium.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk to you because of your recent book, The Icarus Curse: How Western Democracies Derailed and How to Get Back on Track. I really thought it was terrific. I think it hit on a number of questions that have been running through my mind recently, and I'd love to talk to you about it. what I want to touch on is I would like to briefly walk through your background. Obviously you are a member of European Parliament. You're a member. You're the chairman of the Budget Committee. You previously served as the Minister of Finance for Belgium. And my understanding of your professional background is that you were an economic journalist
Yeah.
and writer and professor.
Yeah,
Uh,
not only that, because I'm only 12 years into politics now.
mm,
Well, almost 13 years. So I'm a relative latecomer to politics, and before that, I spent quite some time indeed in journalism, but also in banking and in industry. So I've done a little bit of everything.
got
And
it.
as the closing piece of my career, I thought it was a good idea to try politics.
That nice. It's funny to hear you. I mean, it's how do you feel having gotten into politics a little bit late, but with that background, with that wide range of things that you've already done? Do you feel well prepared?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Of course, you have to adjust to the rhythm of politics, which is not always that efficient or that straightforward as a large part of the private sector I've been working in is working, so that you get accustomed to. But in terms of people management and how to deal with issues, I took a lot I took a lot with me of my previous experiences in journalism, in banking, and in industry. So it's and also, you have the advantage that as a politician, you talk to people from, for example, the banking industry or the industry in general, that you more or less know their world and can more easily see where it is going, what is needed, what is real, and what is a little bit superficial in the arguments that you get before you. So it gives you a little bit, no, not a little bit, it gives you a sharper insight into what is really happening.
Got it. That makes sense. So you are very familiar, as I understand it, with the United States. For your PhD, you studied the Chicago School of Economic Thought, and but Americans, are not necessarily as familiar with European politics. Maybe with the broad strokes, but there's a lot I think Americans don't understand about the European Union and the interplay between the Union and the national governments of its constituent states.
Yeah,
Would you mind just keeping in mind that this is an American audience? How would you kind of describe your politics and where they might fit on the spectrum of U.S. politics?
yeah. Well, the European Union is something that is in the works. You have basically three institutions at the moment, which is the European Council, where the heads
Mhm.
of government of the member states come together. You have the European Commission, who is more or less acting as an European government, but with limited room to move on its own. And then you have the European Parliament. And on a lot of issues, the European Council, together with the European Parliament, are the legislative body that brings about legislation and regulation. There are a few prerogatives where the council can decide on its own, and a few prerogatives or items on which Parliament can decide on its own. But the important decisions, the really well, decisive things always happen in the trilogue, as they call it, between the Parliament and the Council, with the Commission as what is labeled as an honest broker between the two of them. Now, of course, there's a lot of interaction because people in the European Parliament come from the member states. They are often uh, part of a party that is in the government or not,
Right.
and so it's quite complicated. And if you, for example, have uh, have a situation where you have European elections every 5 years,
Okay.
and in the meantime, governments change all the time because local elections are not linked to the European election. And so you can have, which we had in the last term, which ended last year, that at one point in time, the majority of council members, heads of government, was not really reflected in the majority in the parliament. There were different majorities, and then, of course, it becomes quite difficult to get to a consensus.
Yeah.
Um, Difficult, but also quite challenging and in need of creativity to bring it all together.
Yeah.
And that's why it was important for me to be able to function within the Belgian government for almost 5 years, and then come into the European context, because then you have a quite good understanding of how it works in the council.
Hmm.
uh, and so that gave me the nickname that I'm one of the deal makers here in the European Parliament, because, like I said, I'm also familiar with how it works inside the council.
Right. Okay. Wow. Okay. So that does sound very complicated. So you getting to the Belgian politics side of this for a second. So you're a member of the new Flemish Alliance, I believe
Yes.
is that okay. And so that party in Belgian terms is a center right party,
Yeah.
as I understand. Okay. And then so when Belgians elected you to serve as a member of European Parliament, is so that election is separated entirely from
Yeah.
from national elections?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's okay. That is really interesting. And so you couldn't end up in a situation where the people that are in European Parliament, really don't represent what's happening in the home
Yeah.
countries at that point.
Well, for example, in 2014, I was also elected because I came into politics at the end of 2013.
Right.
And then we had elections in May 2014. I was
Mhm.
elected to the European Parliament, but my party chairman decided, first of all, to get me involved in the negotiations on the federal government in Belgium.
Mhm.
And secondly, to appoint me then in September as Minister of Finance. So within 10 months of getting into politics, I was Minister of Finance.
That's
Uh,
a that's a pretty exciting run.
Yeah. And so
Run for
then
local.
there I was replaced as a member of the European Parliament during the period I served as a minister in the Belgian government.
Very, very interesting. Um, wow. And so just one last question on this before we get to the book. But well, as I said, kind of from the book, reading it, your politics would not map neatly into any American party. I think far more concerned about ecological issues, climate change, and the like than the average American conservative, but then certainly more uh, skeptical of some spending and whatnot than the average American liberal.
Yeah.
And so, would you say that your views are fairly mainstream for a European politician? I just from an American perspective, how would you kind of how would you map that over?
I think I would, if I want, if I would like to, or if I would make a comparison with American politics, I would more be the kind of Ronald Reagan, George Shultz type of conservative. I'm quite
Hmm.
conservative. I prefer the word orthodox in terms of economics and monetary issues.
Okay.
Um, in terms of lifestyle and private life of people and things like that, abortion, religion, I'm quite liberal
Okay.
in terms of views and the way in which I see things. I'm a firm believer in law and order. I think where certainly in Europe a lot of things go wrong is because we assign a lot of rights to people, but we forget to assign to also be explicit about the responsibilities. You can only have rights if you also take up responsibilities. And for example, uh, I don't know whether you're familiar with the soccer world in Europe. We had the Champions League finals on
Right.
Saturday evening. Paris Saint-Germain won big time, 5-0 to Inter Milan.
Mm-hmm.
and whole of France was a mess. 3 or 4 people got killed, cars
Right.
burning, shops lifted, um, and that's where I say, okay, this is not acceptable.
Right.
Of course, if you're a supporter of Paris Saint-Germain and your teams win the Champions League, you're feasting, you're going through the streets with the horn of your car blowing, you get drunk, whatever you want, but don't start killing each other, don't start putting fire to cars, don't start attacking shop owners and getting into shops and destroying them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of lawlessness that also in Brussels is more and more common,
Mm.
and where we don't seem to be able to stop it or to say this is the red line and you don't cross that. If you cross this line, then we'll get to you.
Yeah.
Uh, and in that sense, I'm a real conservative. On the other
Yeah.
hand, I don't have any problem at all with gay marriage or that's kind of stuff. If people in their private sphere want to do, they can do whatever they want. Well, of course, not killing each other, but you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so in that sense, I'm a little bit a mixed bag, quite
Yeah.
conservative in economics, broadly defined, and much more liberal as to my view on the world and personal life.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. So moving to the book. So you call it the Icarus curse.
Yeah.
What exactly is the Icarus curse?
Well, you know, the mythological figure Icarus was banned together with his father Daedalus to an island by the king of some Greece kingdom,
Mhm.
Greek kingdom, and the father developed a system where feathers were put on the skin of his son, which allowed him to fly. But he warned his son Icarus, don't get too close to the sun, because then the wax with which we have attached the feathers to your body will melt and you will crash down. But Icarus started to fly. He was cautious in the beginning, but he got more and more, his behavior became more and more risky and up, went too close to the sun and he crashed. I use that metaphor to describe the way in which we've been broadly, and there were always exceptions, but broadly dealing with economic policies.
Mhm.
We've always thought, or we thought too much in the past decades, that throwing money at issues would solve the problem. And apparently it worked. But because it apparently worked, we got, like Icarus, um, we lost a little bit our sense for risk. And so now we're in a situation where the possibility of a real crash, 2008 was already bad, but something worse than that has become real. And in the meantime, because of the policies we pursued and the impact that had on the population, we've also created what I call a great discontent. Policymakers frustrated, people, the public, also frustrated because the promises that politicians have been making over the past decades, certainly in election time, uh, were taken in by the public, but then they were disappointed because a lot and more of these promises could not be realized because we had pushed the policy limits already too far out.
Mhm.
What I label in the book as policy exhaustion, that we have gone so far, especially in budgetary and monetary policies, that one really can ask oneself, what can we do if a new pandemic or a new big financial crisis hits?
Yeah. It so
And the sorry,
No, you're fine.
the background of it all is what I call the legacy of not Keynes, but
Yeah.
the Keynesians, a very crucial difference. I've done a lot of talking about the book, and I've noticed that each time I start to talk about these issues, that people really get interested because
Yeah.
for them it's one big hole or one big ensemble, whereas I make a very clear distinction between Keynes and the Keynesians.
Yeah, and that is that. I mean, that is fascinating because, like in the U.S., and I think as you allude to in the book, in most Western countries, when we talk about Keynes, it's used as a shorthand to talk about this about deficit spending
Yeah,
and about deficit spending to stimulate demand in the economy. And as you note again and again, this is not just something that our governments have done when there's a real need for it in the wake of a crisis, but kind of all the time.
yeah,
Speaking right after Republicans are trying to move Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill through through American Congress, and this is the Republican Party, this conservative party, and this is yet another bill that is going to increase the deficit, not decrease it.
yeah.
And
Well, but
so,
that
yeah,
those who appeal to Keynes for these things are just don't know the history as they should know it,
yeah,
because well, in the 20s, well, up to the late 20s of the last century, the general idea about economic policy was leave the market alone.
hmm,
We don't have to intervene. If there is a recession and unemployment, wages will go down, employment will pick up again because labor demand picks up, and then all the process can start again. Now, the 30s were, of course, a very horrific experience, and Keynes, he was not the first, but he was among the first to say that general laissez-faire, laissez-passer attitude does not hold if you really get into a depression, because then the cumulative negative downward forces are too big to allow market forces to correct them. And you have to intervene as a government, most of all, to re-establish trust and confidence, especially for investors, but also for the public consumers in general. But that is when you are in a depression.
hmm,
Now, the Keynesians, especially on the in Cambridge, UK, the alma mater of Keynes, and in the United States, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, they said, well, that's a great idea. Um, why should we limit the application of this insight to depressions? If we apply this aggregate demand management, because that's basically what they made of Keynes' insight, we can
hmm,
apply it all the time, and like engineers, turning the balls up and down, and then we get kind of eternal growth, full employment. If there is too much inflation or inflation starts to build up, we go back a little bit, and then inflation comes down, and then we can. Keynes was one of the first to say, hold your horses, this does not work like you are describing it now. And there's the legendary meeting in Washington in the autumn of 1944, where Keynes came out of the meeting and said, oh my god, I was the only non-Keynesian in the room. And he repeated that message a few months later in a talk at the Bank of England.
hmm,
And then a few months later, he died,
right,
much too young. So we actually, these are the two indications we have to say Keynes was not a Keynesian. He did not believe in this constant adjusting of the economic framework, because, amongst others, he was well aware of, first of all, the lags in policy. You mean you
hmm,
decide something, you have to execute it, and then you have the impact on the economy.
right,
That can be 3 months, but that can be 2 years.
right,
Uh, and then, of course, what he also very much was aware of was that the political world would misuse this concept. To George Bernard Shaw, he wrote about, he asked him, have you met a lot of politicians? Their stupidity is inhuman. literally Keynes' words that I quote in the book.
Mhm.
So Keynes did not believe this, but the machine was out of the bottle, or the genie was out of the bottle,
Yeah.
and politicians saw a huge opportunity to use an established economic theory, the Keynesian theory, to open the floodgates, to promise more education, more healthcare, higher pensions, more bureaucrats. And if there was a deficit, no problem. If the economy goes up, the deficit will disappear. But if you keep on spending, then of
Mhm.
course the deficit will not disappear. It will
Right.
just be a little bit smaller in boom years, and it will be much larger if your economy goes down again.
Right.
As a consequence, over time, debt builds up, also in the United States, but certainly also in European countries like Italy, France, Belgium,
Mhm.
and you know, I lived as a minister of finance. I lived through the Greek crisis, the famous Greek
Right.
crisis.
Yeah.
Um, and there you, if you went through that, I mean, day by day, being part of the decision making process to try to correct what was so awfully wrong there, then you realize that when the bubble bursts, you get in a lot of trouble, because, with all due respect for the Greeks, but in economic terms, they are a footnote.
Hmm.
They are, I don't know, 2% of the EU GDP.
Right.
If something similar would happen to a country like France or Italy, well, you can't imagine what the consequences would be, but that would be very destructive. So yeah, we have been living a risky life like Icarus,
Right.
and I think the wax is melting at the moment. The feathers are still on, but how well fixed are they? Uh, and I think we're playing with fire. Also, what Mr. Trump is doing now. If you have a mountains of debt floating around, and you start killing the economy, which to some extent he's doing, with not, maybe not so much with the tariffs, but with the uncertainty that he creates. When I talk to CEOs, they all tell me, whatever their sector, with a few exceptions, um, stop it. We first have to see how all this evolves before we start deciding on spending another 100 million or 500 million or 5 billion
Hmm.
dollars of euros in major investment project. And that's, of course, organizing a recession if you have that kind of reaction to your political decision making.
Right. Jeez. Yeah, I've written a fair amount about that so far, about the, the well, just the damaging impact of the uncertainty. But so you write about this confidence trap where there was a period where everything kind of seemed to work out after World War II, where the economists, the Keynesians, the various national governments, they really did kind of, I mean, maybe it wasn't the tinkering that was giving rise to the economic boom, but there was this steady decades long period of economic growth.
Yeah.
Do,
And yeah,
yeah.
and being able, by indeed throwing money around, to push the to kick the can down the road on certain important issues, like for example in Europe, the pension bill. I had a professor whom I also addressed briefly in the book, recently died, whom I consider to be my mentor, who already at the end of the 70s of last century said, we have to do something. Our pension bill is fastly becoming unpayable.
Mm,
We cannot, that kind of taxing those who work to give it to those who leave the workforce, direct transfer. That's perfectly okay if you have a lot of people working and a few people taking their pension. But if that equilibrium starts to move, and you get less and less people working and more retired people, then of course you cannot hold on to that. And now we're taking measures since a few years, but actually at least 3 4 decades too late.
but you are actually doing something in Europe.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
also, of course, with the Ukraine conflict and with the attitude taken
Right.
by Mr. Trump. But uh, I don't. Well, I don't want to blame. I don't want to blame Trump too much for this, because he was certainly not the first American president who told us Europeans, "You have to do more for your defense." He
Right.
told it in a way that we were not used to. Okay, that's something else. But also, even already Mr. Reagan, President Bush, the two Bushes, Clinton, Obama, they all told us, please, we cannot take this responsibility alone anymore. You
Hmm.
should step in, and I think very rightly so. Of course, very rightly so. And now we have to catch up, and we have to do that on a fast moving train. And there's a lot of good things happening,
Hmm.
but that is creating extra pressure on top of all the other pressures that we had already floating around: the aging problem of the population, the climate issue, the debt mountains that we have created over the decades.
Hmm.
And on top of that, now we have a huge defense security issue that also can only be solved by spending money, but spending money in a sensible way, not just spending money. I
Yeah.
think we have to build up capacity.
Hmm. That so let me turn this, because I understand we don't have a ton of time. So I want to ask you one. Well, let's go through. Okay, so the book is fantastic. It's very clear. It lays everything out. I think in great detail. And in a way that is accessible to and applicable to people reading it in America or in Europe. Uh, but so, you lay out in detail how we got to where we are now, but then you also talk about what we need to do moving forward. And you lay out 5 mental resets and then some, general policy prescriptions. And I want to run through those briefly. And because you're not opposed to government spending. This is not just like the
Absolutely.
government can't spend any money. This is the government needs to spend money intelligently
Yeah,
and in a
absolutely.
way, that produces economic growth. So what is good spending?
Well, good spend. Sorry, is spending on the things that not are where money is not spent automatically by the private sector. Social issues,
Mhm.
social inequality. You have to correct the worst extremes of social inequality.
Okay.
That's my personal conviction, but also based on economics. Because if you let social, sorry,
That's
if
no
you
problem.
let social equality get inequality too large,
Mhm.
then you will have a huge problem of stability in your society.
Right.
Apart from the fact that, of course, if you're a rich society, it should not be tolerated that people die on the street, uh, which is, of course, a strong expression, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of public investment, infrastructure. Then we think about roads and bridges and harbors, but of course, more and more also the electronic infrastructure, the
Mm.
ICT infrastructure. And there, I think there's a lot that needs to be done.
Mhm.
Also, when we talk about defense and security related issues, and that's where investment in Europe has been really
Okay.
ridiculously low, because basically uh, our social spending is just too large. We are spending on everything.
Mhm.
Every interest group that starts screaming and shouting gets money in Europe, more or less. And the two consequences: first of all, our overall spending has grown too much. And secondly, and maybe even worse than that first phenomena, those who are really in need, and a lot of people are really in need, get proportionally less and less, whereas proportionally they should get more.
Hmm.
If your society becomes richer, you should be able to spend more on taking care of the people who really need to be taken care of.
Hmm.
And of course, you have to. I mean, if somebody loses his job and he has three own houses, should you pay an employment benefit to that kind of person?
He has three houses that he owns.
Yes.
I would think he probably doesn't need
That's
unemployment
what my
benefits.
point also. So those who lose their job, who have a family to take care of, who have no big or important other
Right,
assets, these people you really need to support
right.
in a way that you incentivize them to get to another job. But you really have to take care of these people, certainly in the short run, the first 3 to 6 months. But a guy with that kind of asset situation,
Mhm.
he should be able to deal on its own.
Right.
So much more selectivity in our social spending. That is what
Mhm.
is absolutely needed in Europe, um, and that's what I also call for. And there are there are examples in Europe where governments succeeded in writing the balance. The Ireland is my favorite example.
Mhm.
They had a debt to GDP ratio of something like 140% after the financial crisis. Um, they took care of it, reducing their debt level to 50% of GDP. How? By stimulating economic growth, amongst
Mhm.
others by tax reductions on investment,
Mhm.
and by keeping the government budget more or less in balance over the course of years. And the debt ratio came down like a rock.
Yeah.
So it can be done. You don't have to do dramatic things, but you have to do a few things that are important and that you keep on doing over the years.
That sounds like good advice, and it would be nice if our politicians would adhere to it. Uh, given that we do have time constraints, let me ask you one last question. I want to get your full view on this. You write in the book that the new geopolitical reality obliges Western democracies to make hard choices, especially with respect to China.
Yeah,
You write a lot about de-risking
yeah,
our relationship with China, not decoupling, but de-risking.
yeah.
What do you mean by that, and why the imperative to do so?
Well, I recently wrote a blog. You can find it on my blog. Just my name. You tick in my name and you get there. The title was "The Great Disruptor," where I say that one of the dramatic side effects of the Trump show, if I
Mhm.
may use that word, is that our attention is drawn away from the fact that, in terms of economics and trade, China is the great disruptor, not so much the United States. China is limiting already since the beginning the entry into its markets for foreign competitors. If you want to invest in China, you can do it, but there are very strict limits and a lot of things that you know how
Hmm.
that you have to to transfer, etc. Coupled with that, China has a very important and quantitatively huge subsidization policy, electric vehicles, batteries, and things like that. And the combination of these two elements, strict protection of their own market and huge
Hmm.
subsidies for selected sectors, make that China is unbeatably competitive in certain domains.
Hmm.
But it's not the result of a level playing field. On the contrary, and so for the international world trade order, economic order, to be able to be continued, we need China to stop with these two important elements of protection of the own market and stimulation through through subsidies. So China needs to acknowledge that they've been able to grow in a huge way
Hmm.
by taking advantage of the Western openness and the Western preparedness to accept China into that international community. But China has never played by the rules. We've been naive about that, and
Mhm.
now it has gone almost too far, and now we start to realize that we have to correct that. And
Mhm.
that's uh, a huge challenge, uh, so huge that I really don't understand why Mr. Trump is not working more in a cooperative way with his known allies, Canada
Yeah.
and Europe, and
Yeah.
Japan and South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, the countries that
Yeah.
I consider to be real American allies. And yes, okay, I can admit that we probably have taken advantage of the United States on certain issues, but it has also not been bad for the United States, that kind of international framework. And so attacking these allies and being not soft on China, but not too strong on China, is something that I find a little bit hard to explain, and that is certainly not a good thing if we really want to again come to an international order in which everybody can have its place and we can all develop together instead of arriving in which is the case now, in a situation where it becomes a zero sum game. If you gain, I
Right.
lose. And if
Right.
I want to gain, you have to lose. That's not the way it worked for half a century, more or less, a little bit more than half a century. And the big bad player is China. I don't
Yeah.
consider the United States to be the big bad player. There are a lot of people in Europe who think that at the moment. I don't share that view. I think we should be still very much interested in a partnership with the United States. And the United States is entirely correct in demanding much more effort on our side with respect to defense and security. But we should unite not against China, but unite
Mhm.
to tell China, look, guys, you're here to stay. Okay, we can accept that. You have your place, we have our place, but you have to play by the rules. If not, then you will meet not only the United States, but the United States accompanied by Australia, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union.
Yeah. And that position where, China would stand to lose access not just to the US market, but to virtually all external markets. That is a much stronger position. Um, Member Van Overveld, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to me. I understand you have to go. It's a heck of a book. Thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure. All the best. See you one
Thank you.
time in Salt Lake City or Denver or Chicago or whatever.
That would be that would be great. All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.